It's been a while since I last did any Drawbox content, but today I thought I should finally add a new challenge. Right now we have the 250 box challenge and the 250 cylinder challenges. There's also the 25 texture challenge, but we are going to focus on something that extends and builds on top of the first two. And that's going to be the 100 chest challenge. And I don't mean the kind of chest that you have on your body, but rather treasure chests. And the reason that I think it's a great tool for learning how to both build solid 3D objects, but also a great tool for learning to design is that it's a simple form, but it can have so many variations. All it really is a combination of a cylinder and or at least half a cylinder and a box. And so by tackling this challenge, we'll be forced to take something relatively straightforward and then build on it to create interesting designs. So the first thing that I want to talk about is when should you be doing this challenge? I think that it's best to tackle it once you've already finished the 250 box and 250 cylinder challenges for obvious reasons, but also for the box challenge, I want you to have tackled the advanced box exercises as well. It's a video that's also contained in the same challenge page. Reason being that we go into a lot of subdivision and also handling the tendency to have mistakes kind of build up over time. We tend to make a lot of small mistakes while we're estimating our perspective. And we want to be able to kind of roll with the punches. Things are not going to come out perfectly the way that we do them because we don't plot out perspective to all of our vanishing points, but we are going to make sure that we can compensate for those mistakes as we move along. So for this, I am not putting any limitations on what kind of tools you use. For most of the lessons and the previous challenges, the focus has been on working in ink, specifically with a felt tip or fine liner pen. In this case, I'm deviating from that because our focus here is not just on the construction of the object, which is still important, but it's also on learning to design. And I feel that if people are too restricted in terms of the tools that they can use, their minds can easily get overwhelmed with that challenge and lose track of the actual design component. And on top of that, if you've already done the challenges, you're probably already well aware of the benefits of working in ink when you're doing construction and that sort of thing. And also the sort of respect for line work and line economy that you get by doing that should have already been instilled into you somewhat. And to clarify, the tools that I am now allowing is basically anything. Pencil, ballpoint pen, digital media, and along with the additional helper tools like ellipse guides, rulers, whatever additional features digital programs offers, anything. The only recommendation I have is that while pencils are allowed, I think you'd be better off using a ballpoint pen if you're looking to use a pencil instead, just because your lines will be more, what's the word I'm looking for? They'll be more, I guess, not precise, but that's about the closest I can think of right now. Pencils have a tendency to go dull and make marks that are larger than you might intend, whereas a ballpoint pen can be very clear and precise, and you can still draw faintly at first and then kind of shore up your lines. I still do want you guys to be following the same methodology as the rest of the Drawbox lessons, which means applying the ghosting method if you're not using a ruler, not being sketchy or rough, being intentional and direct with every mark that you put down, and even drawing through your ellipses if you're not using an ellipse guide. All of these things will still come into play. One thing that I want you to be ready for is that this is going to involve a hell of a lot of line work. We're constructing things in perspective, so we are going to be plotting or lines to an extent. Like, we're not going to be dropping in vanishing points. We're going to be having a lot of lines that kind of go off converging towards and implying certain vanishing points existing, but we're not actually going to be drawing those directly. But we're still going to end up with a hell of a lot of line work because we're going to be subdividing, we're going to be mirroring stuff across the form, so it is going to get messy. That's why being able to control your line work is super important. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a complete, page of garbage. So, I mean, I guess we might as well get started. I want to break this process down into 3 steps, and it's going to be focused on doing 25 box and cylinder combos, which I will explain in a second. I might as well explain it now, actually. So that's just going to be the idea of having a box, and this is going to be a shitty box. And then drawing a cylinder. I should not have drawn that close to the text. I forgot to draw this line. So it'll basically be a cylinder combined with a box to create a chest-like form. And I'll go into more detail with that later. But it's basically going to be the equivalent of a closed chest. And I want us to be doing these from all kinds of different angles to get used to the idea of building a box, then building a cylinder into the box. The next part will be 25 open chests. So it'll be a similar idea, but it'll get a little bit more complicated. Because if I just take this and here's this. And I will explain the general mechanics of rotating a form, like from its closed position to opening. So that was open chests. And for both of these parts, it's going to be focused on just your basic construction. We're not getting into any detail or anything like that just yet. And lastly, once we're done that, we are going to, actually not once we're done that, but 1 second. 50, I don't know what you want to call it, detailed chests. Now, just now, I kind of stumbled over my words, as I often do, because I did not mean that we do these first and complete it all and then do these. Instead, I want you to split up your sittings into doing some of each. So in the proportion that was stated, so 25, 25, 50 would be about like 1 basic closed chest, 1 basic open chest, and then 2 detailed chests. The reason for this is that I want you to kind of warm yourself up each time you sit down to do these things. And it's very easy to kind of get rusty if you're focusing too much on the detailed part of things. They are kind of a progression. You could technically draw the basic forms for a closed chest, then transfer that to an open chest because it uses the same ellipse that you use for the closed chest's lid. And then you can add detail to that. But we are going to break it down into individual drawings so that you are focusing on construction at specific times and then on detail later on. You might find that in some of the lessons, if I've given any of you critiques, that I've said specifically, you know, I wanted you to do a few extra pages, but don't do any detail whatsoever. The reason for that is that we have a strong tendency to get distracted by detail the second we know that we are going to be adding it. If we expect to put in fur and, you know, all kinds of interesting little intricate details, that's what we're going to be thinking about the whole time. And as a result, we're going to neglect some of the more basic fundamental construction components. So for the rest of the video, I'm going to give a quick demo of each of the 3 steps. And obviously my shitty little doodles there will not be what I'm expecting of you. It'll be a more technical approach to laying out the perspective lines, building up our forms, and then, you know, establishing the solid construction. And so, like I said multiple times already, there will be a lot of subdivision. So if you don't understand subdivision, I'll explain it as quickly as I can, although it is covered in Lesson 6 and in the Lesson 6 videos. So subdivision basically works on the principle that if you have, actually I explained this in the advanced boxes too, so you should have already seen this for sure. But just in case, if you have a rectangle, and that's a perfect rectangle with, like, in 2 dimensions, it's got 90-degree angles all over. You can find the center by drawing lines across each diagonal, and where they intersect is going to be the center of the plane. This applies equally in 3D space, which is why we don't just measure halfway, because that you can't apply when your plane goes off in perspective. Because we know that the section that is closer to us will be longer than the one that's further away, so rulers become useless. Instead, we use the exact same diagonal approach to subdivide that plane, and we can also subdivide in the other direction. We just have to guess based on the angle of this line and this line and make it so that this one is one that will roughly converge towards the same location. We're being rough and organic because we're estimating these things so we don't have to lay down our proper vanishing points, and that is where all the mistakes that kind of accrue come from, which is why, again, go through the advanced boxes video and do those exercises before you tackle this. So subdivision is one of the biggest components that we're going to be using. The other one is the idea of mirroring something across an axis, which is the idea that if you draw a line there and you want to figure out where it sits over here, you could just kind of measure this distance and then place it here in this example, but again, in 3D space and in perspective, that doesn't work at all. So instead, we have to use a technique that allows you to mirror a distance across the plane, and you do that by taking where this line, the line that you want to mirror, hits the base of your plane. You draw a diagonal up through this point, through the center point of that plane, or rather through the it's actually the axis that you're mirroring through, but it's still going to go through this center intersectional point. So you draw the line through there, and where it hits here is the same distance. So this distance and this one match. Again, I'm going through this very quickly because it's not the focus of this video. I do cover it in other videos. And then you'd be able to mirror it like this. So you'd know that that line would sit there. And you do the same thing here. If you have a line here, you shoot a diagonal through this point here, the middle of the plane. That was a bit off. And then you just draw it up. So now we know that this distance here is equal to this distance. So we will start by constructing our first box. What I'm going to do here specifically, you'll notice that I'm working in 3-point perspective for all of these, and I want you to do the same. It makes it a little bit more difficult, and by a little I mean a lot, because you're dealing with the convergence of 3 different sets of parallel lines instead of just the 2. But, you know, it's part of the exercise. And if you guys get confused, make mistakes, that's completely normal. There's going to be a lot of line work floating around here, so it's ridiculously easy to get kind of lost. You just kind of have to get used to the fact that that is a common element of these problems. So I'm starting out by putting down a plane. And I'm actually overextending my lines because I want to be particularly careful about how they converge. So these two would be converging towards the same vanishing point. And then you'd have these two. And so when you have the first 2 lines of any set of parallel lines, those are what define where your vanishing point is actually going to be. So these two, technically, I could be quite free with how I place them and how I align them. But as soon as they're kind of placed in, they lock in my perspective. And now anything else I add might be slightly off or might be quite a bit off. So if I were to add another line that was like this one would obviously not be converging with these two. And then I want to do the same thing for the third set of lines. I always have a habit of drawing my straight lines in Photoshop by using the hold down shift button, where put a point down and then you hold down shift and click somewhere else and it'll draw a line towards it. Although it's always had this problem where if you use your tablet pen while you're doing that, it'll pick up your pressure sensitivity, and so it'll obviously taper it out. So I usually end up clicking and then clicking back, and then sometimes it has this gap here, so I have to do it again, or you know. But I've always liked the kind of, I guess, the variation that it adds to my lines. They're not just a uniform stroke like this, which tends to look quite boring. And so I do actually, despite the fact that it's very annoying, I do like the fact that it adds that to my drawings. Assuming it doesn't destroy my wrists to do that constantly. So now I need to add, nope, that was way off. This one roughly converges with the other two. Using a ruler would actually be quite helpful because you can actually see the alignment of your lines relative to each other before you draw them. So I definitely recommend doing that. It'll ease some of the burden. I mean, drawing freehand boxes is still important for box-specific exercises, but even if you're using a ruler, you're still pushed to understand what the alignment of the lines need to be. You're just not kind of practicing your freehand lines at that time. So when I have lines this close together, I'm always keeping an eye on their relationship. I mean, they seem to be pretty close to parallel. Not entirely parallel, but pretty close. And so whenever things are close together, it gives you a good chance to kind of say, well, I want it to be almost the same as this line. Now I'm going to place the top portion of my box, which is tricky. Convergence is probably a little bit off, but maybe I'll try it again. So when you're looking at this, you actually want to, you're looking at both this line and this line, and you know that the one that you just drew is closer to here, so you want to match this a little bit more closely than this one. It's really something that you kind of develop over time, doing this, constantly training your eye to identify, are these things converging, how far off are they? And I'm sure that if I check them, they'd actually be a little bit off, but since our convergence is relatively shallow at this point, it's not such a big deal, because they can be, there's a bigger margin for error before it becomes obvious. But that mistake and those kinds of mistakes will accumulate and will start to bite us in the ass later on, and we'll find ourselves drawing convergences that are slightly off, like purposely off, to compensate for these mistakes. But that's kind of the way things go. So now I want this line to kind of match this one a little bit more. So I'm going to try and nail that. Nope, a bit too much. I guess that's okay. And finally, oh no, there's still two more lines, so not finally. For a second there, I was terrified that I had forgotten to hit record. That would be a little bit terrible. So here we want to look at how it aligns to this one. We're kind of far out. We're not really pinched between two other lines, so it can be a little bit tricky to handle this. It's a lot easier to draw a line that's in between two others than it is to draw one that is way outside, as this one's going to be. Nope, that's off. Good enough, I guess. And this is the one that will actually tell us how far off we were. It's not the best, but it's not terrible just yet. When you're at this point, you can't really, like, correcting that would mean dismantling a lot of other lines, so generally you do your best up until that point, and then if at all possible, you live with whatever mistakes you might have made here. So now we have our box, and we want to place a cylinder in it, but we're going to do that by constructing yet another box, because our cylinder is actually going to be half a cylinder, right? The other half is going to be buried in here, and I still want to construct that as a full cylinder. So we're going to do that by subdividing the box height-wise. Notice this mistake here. I'm not going to correct it, but, you know, it is a problem. And we're already ending up with so many lines just kind of layering on top of each other. And we just need to push through, and before we act, we want to make sure that we're dealing with the right lines. Obviously, having an undo function can help quite a bit. If you're working with ink, you just really need to be careful. So we are going to draw the lines that split our box, and we want to make sure that their alignment is correct. Nope. Placing points, even if you're using a ruler, can be very helpful, because if you're slightly off, you can still see where you were aligning to beforehand and then make your compensations and corrections before you draw an actual line. It's the same idea as the ghosting method, where if you're drawing a box and ghosting all your lines, placing a point is a lot less of a commitment than drawing an actual line. So it can help you get a sense of what the box is going to look like before you've put down any of the important line work. So while these 2 points play nicely with the rest of the construction, it's this one that kind of marries the 2 of them together, and when you define it with this line here, you kind of have to now, you're forced to stick with it when you draw this extra line. So that's another place where mistakes tend to come in. And you're pretty much doing the same thing all the way around, hoping that you haven't screwed up too badly. That sure must be reassuring. And so you'll notice that I'm leaving a little space here intentionally because I'm starting to compensate for mistakes, and honestly that is actually not a great... I'm going to undo some of this and try and aim for a slightly higher point because I definitely am already making mistakes. That should do. And as always, actually plotting out your perspective is ideal if your focus is being precise. That's like there's no argument against that. We are just learning to develop a better intuitive sense of 3D space, learning to understand the convergence of lines without just kind of mindlessly draw to the vanishing point, draw to the vanishing point, and so on. And so putting ourselves in positions to make these mistakes and then deal with those mistakes really gives us a much more solid grasp of what we're doing. And I want to have these verticals here as well. And this one. I think that's probably off a bit. It's hard to say. Well, whatever. And now we are going to do our first mirroring of measurements. You'll notice that I actually extended these verticals quite high, and the reason for that is because I knew I was going to extend this box higher by another one of these measurements. So if the box was 2 units high, I want to actually draw another 1 unit box on top of it. And that's what we're going to use to build our lid. So we'll do that by mirroring through this point, or not mirroring, but transferring over this point. Well, it is actually essentially mirroring because this is our axis. And we're mirroring across its center to find where the same distance, this distance, would fall on this line. So it'd be about here, and then we'll do the same thing from the other side, so we don't have to just approximate. Why aren't my lines drawing? So to here. And then same deal on this side. Oh, I wish I mean, I do have a ruler, and I could totally use a ruler while doing this. Like, I'm using a Cintiq, so I could actually place a physical ruler on there, but I'm not really used to doing that anymore. Okay. So when you're doing this, one fear I always have is when you end up running right alongside another line that should technically be parallel to your line. So like this one and this one. I always worry if they're too noticeably deviating from each other, that would be a real problem. But luckily here, we've actually compensated for our mistakes well enough so that that didn't happen, because that's a big giveaway that, you know, you're just fumbling around. And so that's pretty much our 3 stack box. We now want to draw ellipses in this face and this face to build our cylinder. And this is going to be a pain because ellipses in digital media are extra difficult. And if you have a tool like Lazy Nezumi, that's a I recommend that you use it because it has a great ellipse guide, I guess. It constrains your mouse so that you just draw on the ellipse that you've already planned out instead of kind of winging it. Alternatively, Photoshop does have smoothing now if you're on the latest version, which I'm actually using right now, which is what that pink line is, and it helps too. Other programs have frankly better ellipse options. Like I know Sketchbook Pro has both a very nice ellipse guide tool but also predictive drawing, which will kind of figure out quite confidently what kind of ellipse you tried to draw and then replace your mark with it. And I think I was seeing today even Krita, that's the open source drawing program, also has an advanced ellipse guide tool, but I haven't looked into it. And I'm pretty sure a bunch of others have them as well. Kind of disappointed that Photoshop's lagging behind. But anyway, I have Lazy Nezumi, but I don't want to bother using it right now. The thing about all these extra tools is that they tend to cut into the flow of your drawing. So if you're constantly reaching for a different tool, it can be quite, you know, distracting. So smoothing can also be distracting if you have to set it all the time, like turn it up or turn it down. But at least in this case, it does tend to be a little bit less intrusive, but I'm still going to make mistakes and I'm still going to hit undo. So let's try this out. Oh wow, that's awful. That's not so bad. You'll notice that I did draw through it. I still recommend that if you are not using ellipse guides or ellipse templates, that you do the same. The reason that smoothing helps is because the wobble that we tend to get comes from drawing too slowly and trying too much to control your line. When you're working digitally and you have access to these smoothing tools, it's effectively going to reduce the speed that you need to use before you end up with wobbling. And you actually develop this over time with practice anyways. Like you'll notice that if I were to draw a relatively slow, okay, that's a terrible example. That wasn't all that quick, but it's still relatively less wobbly than it would have been like years ago before I was practicing this. So basically, with practice, the speed that you need to draw at in order to shut off your brain and keep that course correction from happening decreases. But in the meantime, smoothing, if you're working digitally, can help quite a bit. And it's a big help to me when I'm doing my concept art, because I've done a lot of vehicle designs and stuff, and it helps quite a bit. So we have our two ends of our cylinder here, and all that's left is to bridge them. Oh, I actually fell quite short here, but just make a little edit there. Now I'm just kind of reinforcing my outline so that It reads better in this mess of lines. And there you go. You have a closed chest. So for this next step, I'm going to be drawing directly on top of the chest that I've already built, because this video is already running pretty long and I don't want you guys to have to sit there and watch me draw another chest. When you guys do it, I will expect that you draw individual chests for all 100, meaning you do your closed chests, and then you do your open chests, and then you do your detailed chests, and they should all be individual chests. I'm also going to go ahead and tone down the opacity on these lines just so that you can see what I'm doing a little bit better. When I've been doing these exercises for myself, I've been leaving them all at full opacity. I'm kind of pretty used to identifying my lines. I mean, I still make mistakes every now and then, accidentally thinking one line is representing something that it's not. But generally, I have a good sense of it, and I think it's definitely helpful, especially if you end up drawing or even doodling anything on paper, like that is if you're working digitally right now. If you happen to go back in paper, you can't turn down the opacity on things. The best you can do is bring up tracing paper. So I do think that it's best to work on things in full opacity. Ultimately, that's my recommendation. It's not a hard, fast rule, so, you know, do what you want. So this next part, I'm actually going to pull out Lazy Nezumi, which is the one of the tools that I mentioned earlier for, it's made for initially for smoothing brushes, but the only tool I usually use in it is the concentric ellipse constraint, which basically looks like this, and it allows you to draw ellipses based on this guide, and it's actually quite well done. I love the fact that you can vary your pressure as you go. You can it doesn't only draw to where the guide has been placed, it actually moves to where your mouse is. I think it's pretty fantastic, and I don't remember how much it costs. I can check right now. Let's see. And you can get it at lazynezumi.com. It is $35 American. It's a bit steep for you know, if you're just using it for ellipses, although personally I would still consider it to be worth it. But it does have a lot of other great features, and since I last used these features, I think that they've made a lot of interesting additions to them. There's like perspective constraints and stuff like that. But anyway, I'm going to be using it for this ellipse tool. And what I like most about it is the fact that you can actually see these axes. So like this one here is the minor axis. If you're watching where my brush is, this is the major axis. You can move, you can change the degrees very easily. Like you can use these sliders, but it's also mapped to hotkeys. So you can actually hold down the hotkey and move your mouse around, and it'll match the degree or the angle or whatever to where your mouse is. So I've already set this up so that my minor axis is matched to this line here, which is the axis that I want to rotate around. And the degree as well, I matched to, well, what I did here, actually, I'll show you what I did. So if I put the degree all the way out to a full circle here, I wanted it to stay within, like, I wanted the ellipse itself to kind of stay within this box. So initially it was actually sticking out. The contact point would be way out here instead of down here. And so I want the ellipse itself to kind of just stay from its center point here and come up all the way to this point, and I don't want it to come out any further. So what I did was I shrunk the degree until the furthest point to which it came out was right here. coming to the other end of my lid. Now, of course, I haven't explained at all why I'm building an ellipse here. Why do I want to put a giant ellipse that sits all the way around there, floating way the hell off in space? The reason is because we want to take, actually let me draw that a little better. We want to take this line here and to rotate it. And this ellipse here actually represents a perfect circle in 3D space aligned to this plane, like defined by these edges. And so if you know what a circle is, it's defined by every point on the circle is the same distance away from the center point. So if this line was coming up to here, you would get the exact same distance in space if you drew this line here, ending where the circle is. So that way we can actually use it to make arbitrary rotations. Now, obviously, drawing a perfect ellipse is going to be very difficult if you're doing it freehand. You can certainly build a plane first, because you do know where the center is going to be. But it's going to be challenging. So just remember that if you're not using an ellipse guide or digital tools, that your minor axis is aligned to this back line of the chest, like basically where the hinges would be for the lid. And you want your ellipse to come all the way out to here. Needless to say, it's not going to be an easy task to build that ellipse. I wouldn't hold it against you if you just estimated the rotation itself, because this is kind of getting into the territory of vanishing points, because you're drawing way outside of the scope of your actual drawing, like of the object that you're drawing. So if you were to just estimate the rotation, go ahead. But if you do actually have the tools on hand to build that ellipse, go for it. It's definitely advantageous. So since we do have this ellipse here, we're going to use it. And I'm going to create an arbitrary line coming out up to here. And that's going to be how far our lid is going to open. And I want to do the same thing on the other side. Lazy Nezumi has this great feature where you can just slide the ellipse along the minor axis. Of course, the degree will have changed because here this one's sticking out up to here. So we want to bring that in. Actually, no, I think it's, no, we want to bring it out actually. Because if you, the smaller degree will end up with the contact point being lower and we want to move it higher. So we need to increase the degree. And of course, with cylinders, the farther ellipse is going to have a larger degree anyway. So we kind of know that already. And there we go. So we want to transfer this over, and we'll keep it aligned to this as a sort of hint. And there we go. And we certainly could actually do the exact same sort of rotation for if we built a line that was like this and rotated it similarly. We could figure out exactly what the height is going to be. I don't really want to do that. It sounds like a lot of work, and I don't really want to do a lot of work. So I'm gonna guess. I am joking, of course, about, well, I'm half joking about not wanting to do a lot of work. So these lines here are an entirely new set of parallel lines. So our box so far has only dealt in 3 sets, and this is going to be our 4th because that lid has now rotated. That's off. So I'm just gonna kind of guess that the height would be up to here, maybe. There's definitely a lot of eyeballing when it comes to this stuff. Building up that intuitive understanding of 3D space, or semi-intuitive, whatever the case may be. And so now we have our the kind of opened box form of the lid, and now we still want to turn it into a cylinder. So we're going to have to figure out what the center is. That was way off. As was that. So I'm going to use Lazy Nizumi again because I already have it open. And I am just going to... So the minor axis should still be the same, I believe. So either way, it'll go from the bottom of that center line that we just drew to the bottom of this one here, because that's kind of the axis that our ellipse is rotated by. And we want to... Right. So the problem with ellipses is that at least these tools are kind of designed to be drawing perfect circles in 3D space, and our lid is already kind of stretched. So instead of fussing with this tool, I'm just going to freehand it with some smoothing. When doing that, I mean, that wasn't that great. Always keep in mind the fact that this curve is going to be a little bit, no, I mean, this curve actually is going to be deeper. It's going to, the compression of the curve is going to be increased, so you'll end up having it come out more, whereas this one won't. That was really bad. When freehanding these, I usually like to just do the 2 different halves separately. That's almost correct. I really should just name this video Uncomfortable Fusses with Ellipses for an hour. Before I end this video, I'll show you guys some concept art that I did for my job. Lazy Nezumi does not work on OS X, so on Macs, it's a PC only thing. And at work I use a Mac, unfortunately. And so with a lot of that, I had to either freehand my ellipses or use like the ellipse marquee tool and kind of use distort and stuff on it, all kinds of weird little tricks. And it was hell, and I had to do a lot of ellipses for some of my vehicle designs. So I will show you guys that, because you can still make it work even if you don't have a lot of the fancier tools. It's just a pain in the ass. That's pretty much it. And there we have an open lid. So again, I will just darken some of these lines. Forget that. Now, because we're still only interested in the forms themselves, meaning the half cylinder and the box, I'm not gonna stress like having a lip on this, on the interior of this box. But in the next step, we will look into making sure that it's not just flat. We actually have an interior, so we want to put a lip. And there we go. Oh, I guess the this thing would have a lip too. Oh. Anyway, so the next step and the last step is going to be detail. Now, there's a lot that you can do with this. Right now it's just simple forms, but chests come in all kinds of varieties. And so I will show you one last program called PureRef, which is one of my favorites. Looks like this. You can get it at, I should write down both of those. So the Lazy Nezumi one that I mentioned was Lazy Nezumi, which is PC only. And then there is PureRef, which is a great program for building mood boards, which I'll show you in a second. But for now, just this one's $35 for a year, I believe. And then this one is, oh no, that's not $35 per year. That's $35 and then a year's worth of free updates. So you can still use it after those, after the year is over. You just don't get any of the new updates. So technically that is not true. There we go, $35. Then PureRef is free, although they do take donations. So I usually give them a few dollars every time I download it onto a new machine. But it's free and it's works on every operating system, or at least Mac and PC for sure. I don't know about Linux. Oops. So PureRef is great because it allows you to pull images from the internet. Sorry, I'm just grabbing another window. And you can look at these things in one board. You can save a single file with all these images embedded inside of it. And you can zoom in on anything, scale them relative to each other. And you can really do whatever you want. So you can double click and it'll focus in on one of them. It's a great way to kind of store the reference for a single project. And you can organize them however you want. You can also, there's handy features where you can scale them, you can flip them back and forth with hotkeys. So it's a great program to have in your arsenal. So the reason that I'm bringing this up is because the design phase is still relying very heavily on reference, because we don't inherently come to this knowing what a chest should look like. We know the basics of it, but if we restrict ourselves just to what we have in our heads, which is usually a fairly bland and kind of empty visual library, we don't really have a lot of that imagery in our heads right now. Using reference to find details and embellishments that you could use is a great way to start building that visual library, because everything that you incorporate into your drawings, everything you study, everything that you produce will help you remember certain kinds of detail much more easily. And so I want to use some of this information to kind of compile my own chest. So I'm going to put that onto a different monitor. And I'm going to put some detail on this chest. And at this point, you can really just go to town. While there are no wrong answers, there are some designs that will work better than others, so keep that in mind. Don't be afraid to experiment, just expect that, you know, things go wrong. And since we're doing so many, not all of them have to be winners. You just kind of need to iterate and try and see what works and see what doesn't. So I want to start out by adding some additional planking to the exterior of this the box part. So I'm going to do that by extending this a little bit and draw the line out. Oh, that's too far. Now I've added this extra layer, but I want to be able to kind of split it into a few select slats. So I know that I want one slat to end kind of to be built right here. So I'm going to have to construct this line so that it's roughly parallel, or at least converging equally with all the lines that it should be parallel with. And then I want to mirror it across the center. Good enough. So I want to find the center first, which is here. You'll notice that it's slightly out from the old center that we drew, because we've extruded this face somewhat. And then I want to take this point, draw a line so that it cuts through this point that we just found. That seems about right. And then we'll do the same thing from the bottom. Nope. Here. Yeah, that's about right. And so this plank down here is equal in width to this plank, roughly. And when it comes to a lot of the small lines, I would revert to ghosting instead of using a ruler. Like, I mean, it's really up to you. But personally, when I'm really getting into the thick of designing things, I care less about the accuracy of my lines and far more about being able to just kind of put those ideas down quickly. If you're constantly reaching for a separate tool, that can be quite distracting. And the worst thing is that when you break your flow, it can be quite damaging to the process. But, you know, do whatever works for you. If you're okay with that, and if you can handle that kind of break of flow, then that's, you know, it's fine. So now I want to also put 3 planks down the middle here. So what I'm after is plank here, and then that's the center, and I want to kind of divide this space up into 3 separate planks. So 1, 2, I guess 3. So some of it is going to be perspective, some of it is going to be guesswork, as always. Oh, that does not converge nearly enough. If I were doing this in 2-point perspective, it would be way easier, because you'd just be able to go straight up and down and just call it a day. Which is exactly why we're not doing it in 2-point perspective. It's also considerably more dynamic when you throw in the 3rd vanishing point. So there's our center. Now I want to just kind of arbitrarily define the space that we're going to be center is actually starting from there, ending here. So now I want to define our arbitrary kind of 3-plank space. I'm going to go close to this line because it gives me a little bit of a hint in terms of the alignment. And then I'm going to mirror this across and do the same. This center line was kind of terrible. I was way off. And I don't really want to... Like, usually I'll tolerate my mistakes, especially if I've already built other lines using them, but that one I hadn't. So I'm going to try that again. So I want to create my first center plank by doing exactly the same thing. Create a line that defines the width of my plank. And then mirror that line across this point again. Oh, how I wish I had a proper ruler. Good enough. And now all that's left is to do the center one. Another thing about rulers is that while they're great for kind of laying in your strong major shapes, everything being super straight and laser cut can actually undermine some of the more specific design elements that you're after. basically, like, if you look at old worn chests like this, their lines aren't going to be that straight, especially since a lot of the boards were hand hewn and everything was done by relatively simple tools. Not everything is going to be perfectly laser straight in the world. So some of the kind of inaccuracies of working with your hand can actually be quite positive aspects of your design. They can help sell what you're after. I know my boss, who sometimes he does some 3D modeling, or quite a bit of 3D modeling really, and he always teaches his employees to break up any sort of alignment and grid. So if he's working on an apartment room or like a dilapidated tenement or something, he'll take the trim on the walls and he'll purposely add extra vertices in there. So initially, if it's just straight like this, he'll add some vertices here, and then he'll drag these up so that it becomes more like in some basic wall trim. So you end up with, well, maybe the bottom one would still be straight, but you end up with these weird bulges and bends and breaks that just feel like someone's lived in that space, or like someone human with human flaws actually made it. So don't always run away from your mistakes. They can be really strong components to what we're doing. I definitely just got a little confused. Here. Yeah, okay, that's close enough. Kind of eyeballed the middle plank a little bit, but whatever. All the planks are not going to be perfectly identical either, so that's not a bad thing. It may sound a little bit like I'm making excuses for being super rough, which in part I am, but the points that I'm raising are definitely valid in their own right. So we've got these 3 planks. One thing that I love doing, which is kind of a pain in the ass, is having a little bit of extra layering on these curves. So like someone's put an extra band of wood. Yeah. And always remember, whenever you add thickness, you want to make sure that you're not just focusing on one aspect of it, like one side. If you extrude something, it's usually going to be visible in multiple dimensions. God damn it, why is this so irritating? Whatever. Okay, that's terrible. So I want to make this a little bit thicker here. So when we have a position like this and we want to mirror it across, even though we just have this curved surface, we still have the original box version of that form, and so we can still use it to construct our landmarks. So if I undo that, we just place a point here, find the center of our plane so we can mirror across it. So the center's here, our point's here. That's about right. So I can start my curve on this side from here as well. Of course, we do still have to estimate a little bit, as to how far it's going to go up here. That doesn't look entirely right. And every now and then, because things are hard, you're going to find yourself regretting some of the design decisions you decided to make, because maybe it screwed up your drawing, but like I said before, it really doesn't matter. If you're doing 50 of these detailed drawings, a few little mistakes, a few bad choices here and there, or even a lot of them, really doesn't matter. And when it comes to accuracy, you're we are communicating visually. We're not creating. Drawbox is all about learning how to communicate with images. It's not about being utterly perfect. Especially when you're going into concept art, your main focus above everything else is not creating pretty drawing, it's about getting an idea across. So if you were designing a bunch of treasure chests for a fantasy game that a 3D modeler would then have to take, what's more important is that you've actually gotten the ideas across that you wanted to, rather than it being an award-winning piece of art. Now, of course, we do eventually work on making things pretty over time, because presentation is important, but that is not our first focus. And if you are focusing on that primarily, you're doing things in the wrong order. So add some hinges here. Our hinge starts. Then, oh no, it's not. I messed that up. For a second there, I forgot that we were working in 3-point perspective. What else can we do to this thing? We can... Well, let's start by adding a bit more thickness here. At this point, sometimes I wing the perspective stuff more and more because I'm more interested in getting that design across. It's not an entirely bad idea that if you were actually designing something to do something that's a little bit quicker and more design focused, and then come back and draw that design with good perspective and plotting everything out and making sure everything is actually correct. So instead of doing your design and your perfect perspective stuff all at the same time, you break it up so that you are not distracted from the one task that you have at that moment. You'll notice how right here what I just did was I noticed that the center line for the old plane, which we hadn't yet extruded outwards, was here. And then so instead of actually redoing the diagonal method, I did something a little bit quicker and a little bit dirtier. And I just kind of tracked my mental understanding of 3D space to move this point over across the extruded portion and then back down to kind of create where the center would kind of reach out towards. This is another reason that a strong understanding of 3D space can be very helpful, because it determines whether or not your quick little things like this are accurate or not, and can actually be used, or if they will mess you up. So I kind of picture this as being a banded iron type thing with some rivets in it. So let's try and draw some of those in. Always remember that some things are, I mean, many of the things that you're adding are three-dimensional forms, so they might have, you might be able to sell them a little better if you add a little cast shadow or if you play with their alignment. And of course, since you end up with like so much line work, like if we didn't have that toned down, it would look kind of like this. Feel free to go in with just adding black, like thick shadow shapes, or just like areas like this where you've just decided to fill things in more with some stronger separation, because it can really help the communication of what you're drawing. And of course, line weight is huge in separating out your forms. The main purpose of line weight, as far as I'm concerned, is kind of clarifying the overlaps of different forms. And one thing that a lot of people do is that they will try and apply line weight to the entirety of an existing line, when that's usually not the case, like not what should be done. Line weight is meant to be applied to kind of local areas of a line. So if your line is like long, like that, you might only need to add extra line weight here. And then you kind of have to blend it back in with the rest of the line. Of course, it's kind of a shitty quick example, but... Oh, where's what I just do? Actually, that should go too. So there's of course a hell of a lot more that you could do with this, but I'm kind of... This video has already run way too long, so I should call it quits. And you don't always have to kind of be really overbearing with all of your detail. You can certainly imply some of it. Like, notice how these lines are not going all the way across. I'm just kind of suggesting where they open and where they end. And, you know, you can always add a little bit of a shadow shape, which is entirely not measured. Or really all that well thought out. That was just an arbitrary guess as to what the shadow might look like. So, yeah, that's basically the challenge. I mean, there's a lot more that you can do with it than just this, or you can choose to, you know, be a little bit timid at first. But I do hope that people who do this challenge will kind of push themselves to be bolder and bolder with every iteration. 50 detailed chests is a metric shit ton. That is not a small amount of work by any stretch. Like, you saw how long I spent on this one chest. It's been probably over an hour by now. Oh god, it's been longer than that. But yeah, so this is... It's really demanding, and I hope that you guys will share your chests on the Discord to get kind of opinions from other people, see how you've been going about it. All in all, don't take this lightly. Don't expect it to be something ridiculously easy, or, you know, something that you can do without focusing. Take your time, and generally, like, don't grind either. Like, if you have a sitting and you decide, okay, I'm going to do some chests today, do like, I don't know, 2 or 3 or 4. That's pretty much all I can say. I hope this video was informative. Whether or not you choose to do the challenge, it's definitely going to be up there for you to do. So give it a try. and see what comes out of it. Thanks for watching.